Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As you can tell, my talk today is one that is concerned with emergent forms of urbanism in a territory and future imagined as Asia. I'm interested in the distinctive historical conjuncture of economic hegemony where nation-states in Asia are embarking upon ambitious projects of urban developmentalism and even taking up the urban poor as objects of governance. But in doing so, I want to demonstrate how the analysis of such urbanisms may transform the canon of what we may consider to be urban studies. In my previous work, I have argued, inspired by Jennifer Robinson, that it's time to rethink our geography of authoritative knowledge. And that authoritative knowledge often looks like this. That authoritative knowledge, which we often designate as theory with a capital T, operates through what Robinson has called the regulating fiction of the global city. Conceived as control and command nodes of the global system, these global cities, mainly located in the First World, are seen as drivers of global change, while cities in the global South, scripted as megacities, are usually off the map, seen at best as being big but powerless. I'm going to suggest to you that these megacities, usually recovered through ethnography, are often written out of what circulates as theory in the canon of urban studies. So, as Peng Chia has noted, we need to understand more fully the schema through which the subject of universal knowledge becomes isomorphic with the West and all other regions become consigned to particularity. With this in mind, in my work, I've called for new geographies of theory, those that take serious account of the urban experience of the global South. My argument has been that an urban theory produced in the crucible of southern cities can transform the study of all cities, including those in the global North. It is thus that Steve Pyle has called for a provincializing of Western cities. I take that to mean attention to postcolonial theory, especially lines of theory that can demonstrate the parochial character of universal knowledge claims. Steve Pyle, for example, designates Western cities as a strange case, thereby provincializing the seemingly universal. It should be obvious by now that the task of producing new geographies of theory has important implications for planning practice as well. In a recent and influential intervention, Vanessa Watson has argued that the past dominance of the global North in shaping planning theory in practice has limited the ability of urban planning to respond to growing problems of poverty, inequality, informality, rapid urbanization, and spatial fragmentation. For Watson, this now dominant urban condition requires that planning take up the charge of what she calls seeing from the South. Now, of course, the global South is not just in the global South, rather it is everywhere. In border neighborhoods, in military urbanism, in ghettos, in foreclosed suburbs. Can third-worlding the West make possible the imagining of alternative urban futures? I'd like to think it can, and I'm very pleased to be here today with Jim Holston and Edgar Pietrice because their work are exemplars of how new geographies of theory make possible the imagining of alternative urban futures. So in a recent co-edited book titled Worlding Cities, Iwa Ong and I take on this task of new geographies of theory by situating our analysis in a place called Asia. Our focus on Asia is a provocation to think about the urban century as an Asian century. It is also a critique of the claims made, especially in India and China, of the ascendancy of an Asian century, and thus of new formations of economic hegemony. We put forward such a critique at a time when these Asian powerhouses seem to have discovered the urban question, and by disassembling the Asian city as a milieu of intervention, we hope to disassemble Asian capitalisms. In that sense, Asia for us is a methodology. By that I mean that the idea of Asia functions for us as much more than a geopolitical location. Asia for us is a circulation. So in worlding cities, we are particularly interested in the forms of intercity referencing through which an inter-Asian urbanism is produced. Put another way, this is a call to take up a latitudinal analysis of global urbanism, whether it be in Abdul Malik Simon's sense of these latitudes being hundreds and hundreds of small initiatives, or our own sense of lateral spaces of production, or some of my work on the citationary structures of contemporary capitalism. In particular, we settle on one concept, worlding, to move beyond the established maps of global cities versus megacities. We mean by worlding how cities of the global south have been worlded in the discourses and imaginaries of urban studies. We mean by it also the worlding city as a milieu of intervention, which builds on Iwa Ong's earlier work on neoliberalism as a mobile technology. And in particular, we're interested in how these interventions take on the norm of the world-class city and how such experiments begin to circulate as universal forms. And we also mean worlding to be the practice of subjectivities. It is in this sense that worlding cities are mass dreams rather than imposed visions. So today I want to analyze worlding as the making of post-colonial futures, post-colonial urban futures, by paying attention to a new space of governance in India, the efforts to reform the Indian megacity by reforming the slum. The megacity, of course, has become a metonym for underdevelopment, third worldism, the global south. And it is the slum, the third world slum, that constitutes the iconic geography of this urban and human condition. The slum is, as Mike Davis has described it, the warehousing of surplus humanity. In his imagination, a place of twilight struggles. Put bluntly, the slum is the most recognizable frame through which cities of the global south are understood and diagnosed. But more recently, a new narration of the slum, and indeed of the megacity, has emerged. The slum now conjures up an abject but uplifting human condition, one that lives in filth but is animated by the alchemic ability to survive and thrive. The slum is now a place of enterprise and of economic alterity. So, for example, as a response to the film Slumdog Millionaire, which I'm sure many of you have seen, which was said to be located in Dharavi, Asia's largest and perhaps most famous slum, urban advocacy groups in India crafted an alternative frame of Dharavi, and indeed of the megacity slum, as a vibrant and vital global economy. Writing in the New York Times, Mumbai-based advocacy group Pukar wrote the following: Dharavi is the most active and lively part of an incredibly industrious city. People have learned here to respond to the indifference of the state. Dharavi is all about resourcefulness. It started out 60 years ago as a small village and grew with no government support to become a multi-million-dollar economic miracle. No master plan, no urban design, no zoning ordinance, construction law, or expert knowledge can claim any stake in the prosperity of Dharavi. What this narrative asserts is what Burj Khalifa, one of India's very famous journalists, has called the Jugaad spirit. Jugaad is a word used in India to talk about a marvelous invention, which is a hybrid automotive that welds the body of a jeep with the engine of a water pump and looks like a tractor. This is not really Jugaad, but it was the cover of the book that I did with Nizar Al-Sayed on urban informality. And these are all images and descriptions of what has come to be understood as spunkiness, the bricolage of the urban poor. It is thus that a recent architectural exhibition presented Indian urbanism itself as jugaad urbanism, as the duct-taped ingenuity of the slum economy. And it is thus that star architect Rem Koolhaas interprets the urbanism of cities like Lagos as a culture of make-do. In his encounter with Lagos, part of Harvard's project on the city, Koolhaas is taken with the inventiveness of slum residents, and in fact, he sees their experiments as generating, I quote, ingenious critical alternative systems, a type of self-organization creating intense emancipatory zones. Working in the context of the Middle East, Asif Bayat argues that informal life, characterized by this sort of bricolage, is the habitus of the dispossessed. And this, for him, is the global urban future. These ideas also bear striking resemblance to the sketch of post-capitalism put forward by geographers Gibson Graham, their celebration of what they call the exciting proliferation of projects of economic autonomy and experimentation. Making a case for the performing of new economic worlds, Gibson Graham urges us as researchers to showcase and reinforce and validate these ontologies of economic difference. Now, I'm highly sympathetic to these renditions of third world urbanism, to these ideas of an ontology of economic difference that require our critical attention, because these are important correctives to the silences of urban theory, to that sanctioned ignorance that for so long has overlooked the urban majorities of today's world. But I have two concerns. First, there's an uncanny convergence between the utopian post-capitalist visions put forward by the left and the populist schemes of neoliberal ideology. Take, for example, the ideas of Hernando de Soto, who commands the attention of many of the world's leaders, who presents the third world slum as a people's economy populated by heroic entrepreneurs. For De Soto, such shadow economies are rich in assets, albeit in the defective form of what he calls dead capital. The mystery of capital for De Soto is how such assets can be transformed into liquid capital, thereby unleashing new frontiers of capital accumulation. Much of my recent work has been around this conversion of poverty into capital, and it requires of us constant vigilance in how we conceptualize economies of poverty. I'm going to return to this in a moment. But my second concern is that in the study of Southern urbanism, it is crucial that we transcend the familiar metonymic categories of megacity and slum, and instead pay attention to how these are objects of governance, how such spaces and imaginations are implicated in emergent formations of economic hegemony and ambitious statecraft. So for this, let me turn to the case of India, where claims of an Asian century are very much part of the effort to govern the megacity and reform the slum, all hinging on the idea that the future belongs to the powerhouses of Asia. In India, the Asian century has been marked by the reinvention of the developmental state, and in particular by a new interest in the urban. That interest in the urban has been a violent expansion of the frontier of urbanization, a making of the Indian world-class city through the smashing of the homes and livelihoods of the urban poor. So, for example, in Mumbai in 2004-2005, city authorities sought to implement a new Vision Mumbai plan through the eviction in a matter of a week of 300,000 slum dwellers. Produced by the global consulting firm McKinsey & Company, the Vision Mumbai plan imagined Mumbai as the next Shanghai and insisted that the Shanghaification of Mumbai was predicated on the speedy removal of slums. the evictions came to be known in India as the Tsunami. In Delhi, as the work of Gautam Bhan shows, and you're seeing here a before and an after of an informal settlement on the edge of the river, there has been an acceleration of slum clearance, a quite literal erasure of entire communities from the urban map, authorized and legitimized by a series of judicial rulings issued by the Delhi High Court and the Supreme Court of India. In Calcutta, the state has promoted the rapid urbanization of the city's rural eastern periphery through the development of new towns. Underwritten by public-private partnerships, these urban communities are formed through the erasure of the land and livelihood claims of squatters, sharecroppers, and through the enclosures of wetlands, fisheries, and other commons. Nationwide, India's Ministry of Commerce and Industry has facilitated the formation of special economic zones, SEZs. The freeing up of land for such zones has turned out to be a violent process, a land grab by the state. What I'm suggesting then is that such forms of urbanization are being underwritten by an activist state that has actively sought to deregulate space. The state activism has involved at least 3 types of urban interventions: slum evictions, special economic zones, and peri-urban new towns. We can designate this type of activist state as neoliberal, and if we do, we must recognize that this is a form of neoliberalism that is homegrown, that this is a homegrown conjuncture mediated by state practices, diasporic investment, and middle-class associational life. It is in this sense that the Indian world-class city, understood as a claim to the Asian century, must be understood as a master dream. I borrow this phrase of a master dream from Suketu Mehta, who has argued that just as cinema is a master dream of the audience, so Mumbai is a master dream of the peoples of South Asia. One example of the making of this master dream comes from a recent advertisement campaign in India, a branding campaign called India Poised. And I know this text is difficult to read. I'll read you an excerpt. But what is being branded here is not a corporate product, not even a city. It is India itself. And it's a branding campaign run by India's largest media conglomerate, the Times of India. The campaign tells a story of India versus India, of one India that is hesitant in the face of progress, that holds back, and the other India who has faith in success, an India that no longer boycotts foreign-made goods, but buys out the companies that makes those goods. One India that looks up at the sky and says it's time to fly, and another India that is the leash, holding back this progress-prone India. In the YouTube video that promotes the campaign, India's most famous movie star, Amitabh Bachchan, narrates India versus India set in a curious landscape, an unfinished highway along the Arabian Sea. The construction site is reminiscent of the urban industrial edifices of modernization. And above all, it is devoid of people, of the messiness of the India that is the leash, of the India that stands in the way of progress. This is partly the ways in which a new India is a master dream, but the making of this Indian vision, the making of the Indian world-class city, also functions through constant reference to other Asian models of development. So from Dubai to Dalian, world-class cities are implicated in each other's futures. And by that I mean that Asian cities constantly reference one another in the making of the Asian century. India's special economic zones, for example, are explicitly modeled after those in China. When the passage of this Special Economic Zones Act took place in the Indian Parliament, a member of Parliament talked about China as a shining example of a country that had developed through special economic zones, and it was time for India to catch up. In Delhi, billboards such as this line the streets. These are billboards put up by Emaar MGF. Emaar is Dubai's largest property capital firm. MGF is an Indian real estate firm. Their motto is creating a new India. Look at the reference. The reference is to the downtown Dubai project, at the heart of which is the world's tallest building, the Burj Dubai or the Burj Khalifa, and thus the only thing higher is our dream for India. These references are quite interesting and of course are quite fragile, because if you know the story of the Burj Dubai / Burj Khalifa, this is in fact a rather bankrupt model. That while this has become an important reference point for forms of development all across Asia, not just in India, the city-state of Dubai has been in massive debt, specifically $10 billion in debt over this development alone, such that the only way that the project could be completed and the Burj Dubai could be opened was through a bailout of the city-state of Dubai by its oil-rich neighbor, Abu Dhabi. When the Burj Dubai opened last year, it had been renamed Burj Khalifa, referencing Sheikh Khalifa, the ruler of Abu Dhabi. So these are quite complex processes of speculation, and yet, of course, they are referenced as models that are now actively in circulation throughout Asia. I want to suggest to you that the practice of referencing Asia is not confined to the activist state. It is also the work of an emerging urban civil society dominated by elite think tanks and middle-class associations. So when the Vision Mumbai plan was put forward by McKinsey & Company, it turned out that there was a powerful Mumbai-based NGO that had in fact commissioned the plan, called Bombay First. This is an elite NGO, one that explicitly references Shanghai as a model for Mumbai. Leading up to the Vision Mumbai plan, Bombay First said, when we talk of a resurgent Asia, people think of great changes that have come about in Shanghai. But we can transform Mumbai in the next 5 years in such a manner that people will stop talking about Shanghai and Mumbai will become the talking point. The idea of a resurgent Asia inevitably rests on a certain vision of entrepreneurialism. So if Mumbai is a center of global finance, but that entrepreneurialism is also seen to be more pervasive. So one of Bombay First's narrations of Mumbai is that Mumbai's entrepreneurialism is present in all aspects of economic life. On their website they write, take Mumbai's taxi drivers. You don't need GPS with them around. They know every nook and cranny of the city. This is Asian entrepreneurialism. So the point I'm making here is that the construction of the Asian century, the making of the Asian world-class city, is not just about splintering urbanism or secessionary citizenship. It is also very much a vision that is engendered through claims of integration, public interest, and urban democracy. It is a reclaiming of the city, of the urban commons, rather than a retreat to gated enclaves. And this often takes place under the sign of the middle-class consumer citizen. What Amita Bhavishkar in her work has talked about as bourgeois environmentalism, where the cause of the world-class city is taken up as the good city, but the good city as a space of inhabitation for the middle-class consumer citizen. And by extension, a place that cannot house those who are not propertied, those who in fact are the urban poor. Now, of course, the making of the Indian world-class city is subject to contestation. And for a few years now, I have been charting the ways in which the Indian world-class city comes to be confronted and indeed encircled by a blockade. I'll give you a few examples. In 2006-2007, two uprisings in the state of West Bengal presented a blockade to the Indian world-class city. So at Shingur, a site at the edge of Calcutta, which was to house the Tata Corporation's flagship nanocar factory, massive mobilizations broke out against the siting of the factory and against the land grab that had made possible the factory. Now, it's important that this was a factory that was going to build the nanocar. You see an effigy of it being burnt here. But the nanocar is the world's cheapest car. And in many ways, it's part of the dream images of middle-class consumer citizenship in India. It is the ticket to auto-mobility for India's middle classes. But here, the state government, a communist government, had procured land from local peasants and sharecroppers, and it provided massive subsidies, in David Harvey's terms, geo-bribes, to the Tata Corporation, India's wealthiest corporation. And here, opposition parties mobilized the displaced. In a couple of years, the Tata Corporation had to move out, unable to open its factory at this site. Similarly, at Nandigram, a village at the peri-urban edges of this metropolitan region, the same communist government sought to put into place a special economic zone modeled after those in China. In this case, village land was to be transformed into a chemical hub owned by an Indonesian conglomerate. Here, a peasant uprising refused entry to the armed functionaries of the state, and despite brutal state repression, the peasant movement held its ground, becoming a cause for nationwide anti-displacement movements. These barricades at Shingur and Nandigram have transformed the landscape of electoral politics in India. In the region, the Left Front government, which had been in power for nearly 30 years, was last year voted out of office. But the blockade is also an unmaking of consent to the sign that is Asia. So the Chinese model of development is quickly losing legitimacy in India, and Indian politicians today talk about how the Chinese model cannot be an appropriate reference for a democratic context. I'm also interested in how these struggles have called into question key instruments of urban planning in India, from eminent domain to zoning. And let me give you one example from Calcutta. Aside from the struggles in Shingur and Nandigram, there are numerous everyday struggles that play out over the making of the world-class city. One such blockade was this: quarter number 411, occupied by a guy called Shampu Prasad Singh. This factory quarter was the last holdout in a tract of factory land that had been converted into the city's upscale South City retail and residential complex, which you see rising up here in the background. The workers were evicted from their quarters with no prior notice and with no compensation. One guy, Shampu Prasad Singh, refused to make way. He was the blockade. He was eventually evicted and the South City project was built, but his blockade triggered important scrutiny, at least for a moment, of the very nature of urban planning in Kolkata. It soon became evident that this entire complex had been built in violation of environmental laws and through the enclosure of some of the city's largest water bodies. I write about such processes as examples of elite informality and elite illegality in my continued effort to dissociate urban informality from the practices of the poor. So in India, forms of elite informality have been tolerated, formalized, celebrated, while the informal practices of the poor, subaltern informality, have been systematically criminalized and marginalized. For a moment, Shampu Prasad Singh's blockade made evident these towers as the towers of violation, making visible the forms of elite informality and illegality through which the Indian world-class city is built. Now, what I've described to you is a process of urban dispossession and enclosure. It is also the making of the dream image, a term I borrow, of course, from Walter Benjamin, the dream image of a world-class city. These are perhaps somewhat conventional and continental Marxist interpretations of contemporary urbanism. Let me suggest that the cities of the Global South require us to exceed such interpretations. In particular, they require us to think about postcoloniality. By the postcolonial, I don't mean the historical condition of postcolonialism. Instead, I mean technologies of rule that are inscribed with the coloniality of power, but equally with the aspirations of self-government. In my most recent work, I have been interested in conceptualizing the Indian world-class city as an infrastructure of post-colonial self-government. What I mean by this is that alongside the crude violence of slum evictions and land grabs for special economic zones, alongside the aesthetics of world-class city making, alongside the circulation of global models of urbanism, is also the complex project of governing the megacity. And in India, this is now unfolding as a crucial worlding practice. So as I begin to wrap up my talk today, I want to share with you an example of some of these bold new imaginations of self-government. And one of these is a policy announced last year in India titled Slum-Free Cities. This is a policy that targets 250 cities in India with 32 million people living in slums. Post-colonial government, at least in India, seems to have discovered the urban question. And the target is precisely that metonym of the megacity, that metonym of underdevelopment, the slum. The policy, which seeks to transform these cities into slum-free cities within the next 5 years, has its inherent contradictions. On the one hand, slum-free cities signals what one of its main architects has titled a New Deal for India's urban poor, the attempt to create safety nets and social protection policies for the urban poor. On the other hand, the policy seeks to transform slumland into urban assets. And indeed, the imagination of slum-free cities has been widely prevalent among the proponents of slum redevelopment. It remains to be seen how slum-free cities unfolds. But what I'm interested in here is how this agenda of post-colonial self-government takes up the megacity and in particular takes up the slum. Slum-free cities is part of India's National Urban Renewal Mission. Launched in 2005, this is a $22 billion national plan for the building of urban infrastructure, evocative of Nehruvian modernization. It is also the conduit of an important government mandate, which is reform. Reform, as is also the case with urban infrastructure financed by the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, is a broad term which includes both economic reforms and the restructuring of systems of governance. So, for example, the slum-free cities policy requires each state in the Indian Federation to prepare a slum-free plan of action. But that slum-free plan of action must include certain key reforms. And one key reform, one that is mandatory, is, I quote, to give primacy to a public-private partnership model that would allow cities to cross-subsidize slum redevelopment through floor space index and land use concessions. These are lines of reform that were established with the National Urban Renewal Mission and that are very much about leveraging public funds in order to promote private sector participation in urban development. In a seminal piece, Malini Ranganathan and her colleagues have shown how such reforms not only engender commercialization, but also transform citizenship itself, producing new notions of urban citizens as stakeholders. These are, in other words, political infrastructures, or what Ranganathan and her colleagues call infrastructures of consent. Reform here and the transformation of citizenship hinge on the financialization of urban infrastructure, of megacity infrastructure, and in many ways, this is the work that is going on with the slum-free cities policy, One example of this is the large presence of USAID reforms in India, much of which is about building financial institutions that can privatize urban infrastructure. I'm interested in the ways in which such projects of financializing urban infrastructure, of reforming slums, requires the transformation of these spaces into what Matthew Gandhi has called governable entities. And there's an entire lineage of reforms then tied up with the task of making cities slum-free. In India, this includes the reform of property taxes, the levying of user charges for urban services, the repeal of urban land ceiling acts, the simplification of the conversion of land from agricultural to non-agricultural uses. And it also involves the production of an unprecedented data space, the mapping, surveying, and documenting of slum lands through elaborate technologies, from satellite images to ground-level spatial data to slum surveys by NGOs. Ultimately, I would argue that what is at stake here is a new understanding of property as the basis of the reformed megacity. And there's some very interesting connections and disconnections with Jim Holston's presentation this morning, because the Indian debates around property are quite different than the Brazilian ones that continue to work with the idea of the social function of property. In the Indian case, the problem of slums is being conceptualized not as a housing policy or housing problem, but rather as an issue of property. The New Deal for the urban poor rests on the conferring of property rights to the poor. Now, such security of tenure for the urban poor in India is radical. Yet such an intervention also consolidates what Asher Gertner has called the propriety of property. Not surprisingly, these arguments about property titles for the poor have referenced one doxer, the ideas of Hernando de Soto. In announcing slum-free cities, India's Minister of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, in a talk titled Inclusive Paradigms for Inclusive Growth, welcomed De Soto to India as one of the world's most influential thinkers and posed the following question inspired by him. How do we create a process by which the poor can convert capital from the extra-legal to the legal sphere, and in so doing, contribute to the GDP at the bottom of the pyramid? It is thus that India's first urban social protection policy is also an endeavour to title and revalue property. It is thus that security of tenure in newly visible slum lands becomes the basis of what in previous work I have called poverty capital, or the convertibility of poverty into globally circulating capital. So in conclusion, let me make 3 points about the significance of this sort of post-colonial self-government for how we think about cities and their urban majorities. First, it's instructive to pay attention to the historical conjunctures at which the terrain of the urban becomes the matter of government. Following Paul Rabinow, such an emergence must be understood as a field of rationality, a normative project for the ordering of the social milieu. Reforming the megacity by transforming slums into governable entities is one such normative practice. It is also a worlding practice. Second, the theme of post-colonial self-government leads us to the broader question of development. In a provocative recent essay in the journal Antipode, Gidwani and Reddy argue that India's urban present is a post-development formation, one in which the urban poor is superfluous to a regime of capitalist value, and where neither the apparatuses of the state nor the urban bourgeoisie seek social engagement with the surplus humanity. Slum-free cities contradict such a reading. It demonstrates the constant reinvention and renewal of development. Now in India, this new deal for the urban poor is not the social function of property. It's not Brazil's right to the city. It is not what Sue Parnell and Edgar Pietries in the context of South Africa have called the universal right to the city, the moral platform from which the developmental role of the state should be defined. But it is a social engagement with those hitherto rendered superfluous. I'm interested then in how accumulation and even dispossession proceed not through abandonment, but rather through inclusive paradigms of development, by making sure that the poor man has his value represented on paper. Yet another much-quoted line from De Soto's recent visit to India. Finally, I'm arguing that despite the long reach of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and the USAID, slum-free cities is an instance of post-colonial self-government, of the ways in which nation-states and cities in the global south are remaking the task of government itself. This is important because at the start of the urban century, we must foreground these cities in the global south as subjects of history. In his important post-colonial treatise, Provincializing Europe, Dipesh Chakraborty notes that European thought has often consigned non-Western nations to the waiting room of history. One can argue that in the maps of urban theory, cities of the global south, too, have been consigned to the waiting room of history. This cannot be the case any longer. And studying the making of post-colonial futures allows us to provincialize urban theory itself. It also begs the question of how we view the political. I've suggested to you that the making of the Asian world-class city is subject to constant contestation. This is the visible social movement, and it's one example of the political. The attempt to govern and reform the megacity through policies like slum-free cities is yet another instance of the political. And it is the political as it relates to the making of post-colonial futures. One final image about the political, that post-colonial futures are haunted by a certain kind of the political, and that political is impasse, it's stasis, it's standstill. I'm borrowing this idea of standing still from the photographic work of Malaysian artist Simran Gill, who took photographs of ambitious development projects in Malaysia that were abandoned before completion. They capture what Simran Gill calls a place in time. She writes, a place in time where one might say the past lies in ruins, unkempt and untended, and the future also has been abandoned and has started to crumble. No way forward, no way back. Her photographs, I would argue, interrupt the fantastic teleology that is the East Asian miracle. It is dialectics at a standstill. I borrow the phrase dialectics at a standstill from Walter Benjamin. In his 1935 expose on Paris, Benjamin writes, ambiguity is the appearance of dialectic in images, the law of dialectics at a standstill. This standstill is utopia and the dialectical image, therefore dream image. I'm very interested in the ways in which the post-colonial archives are filled with whispers of rebellions, blockades, slowdowns, but also then with the sheer fact of standing still, of a standstill, of the impossibility of completing what has been planned, of the future being abandoned. So in Calcutta, on the edges of the city, those ambitious new towns, in fact, have been abandoned before completion. Here, services have not been provided, and in many ways, the middle classes who have moved to these settlements must survive as slum dwellers and squatters do in poor, informal settlements, buying water from vendors, using diesel generators because there isn't electricity. They have to make do with unpaved streets. Many are quickly moving out, abandoning the future. In Dubai, in the shadows of the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building, there's International City, a 2,000-acre development where also the future lies in ruins, where in fact apartment buildings are completely vacant, storefronts are empty, piles of construction debris, flooded parking lots. And in China, extravagant new cities, such as those built in the north, like Orders, Tomorrowlands that are ghost towns. Again, the future abandoned before it has been inhabited. Speculations that have not produced residents. This is, to borrow a phrase from Abdul Malik Simone, the ghostly order in cities. It is where the circulation of capital slows, falters, trips over itself. It is where the dream image becomes dialectical image. Ruins of a world-class future, these ghost towns give me hope. They are disruptions in the master narrative of Asian futures. They are signs of a distinctively political character in the making of post-colonial futures. Thank you.